thank you very much for this opportunity to join this very timely discussion, and also to the very able speakers who've gone before me, who've covered most of the ground, thankfully. So I'll try and keep my comments as short as I can, even although I'm not well known for having nothing to say. But can I just say I'd like to commend the Deputy High Commissioner for her focus, in particular on pervasive racism and on disaggregated data, which I will return back to. And also to Francisco Calazai, whom I've known for many years, also as a member of CERD, on reflecting the need to reflect the diversity of the peoples that are part of any one country. And also to speaking also about goals that are not just yet achieved, and lawsuits that are used against people, and to Ibrahim Gusey for your reflection on the rule of law, and thankfully for your reflections and reminder of the work of CERD, which I will definitely try not to repeat, because I'll probably not remember it sufficiently to get it right. I have currently the honour to be chair of the Minority Rights Group and of Pavee Point, and I want to acknowledge the insights that I've gained through my engagement with both of these organisations, and from a lifetime of work with marginalised and minority groups, including migrants and women's groups, from the local to the global, and how these inform the comments and suggestions I will attempt to make today, as do the resolution and our regional and global covenants and conventions, in particular ICERD. I'll first of all say a little bit about my own starting points, go on to speak about racism in the context of today's discussion, and make some comments on associated issues, and then I'll finish with a few suggestions. Working as an immigrant with the Irish community in the UK of the 1970s, thus betraying my age, was a rapid personal introduction to racism, as a number of groups were wrongfully convicted, Irish people, of crimes they did not commit, and Irish accents evoked unwarranted responses reminiscent of the no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs of the 1950s. My 1980s return to Ireland, where conviction that ours was a monocultural, non-racist society, allowed deep-rooted racism against travellers to fester, illustrated for me the complexities and contradictions, which are well outlined academically, of post-colonial participation by both colonised and colonisers in reinforcing racism at every level, and the reality that this needed to be addressed not just in my country, but also regionally and globally. My commitment as a community worker to the rights of marginalised to participate in shaping and making policies affecting them has informed the work I've undertaken as an academic and a member of the international organisations, including CERD. Such participation is well reflected in the resolution that informs today's discussions, and in the General Assembly and Human Rights Council and treaty body recommendations and conclusions referred to in the associated materials. Moving on then. The states parties to ICERD have committed to the elimination of racism and racial discrimination as defined in its Article 1, and agreed to be reviewed by CERD voluntarily regarding their progress in this direction. I don't want to repeat all of this, but I think it's worth reminding us and paraphrasing that this commits to the elimination of preferences or exclusions based on race, colour, descent, national or ethnic origin, which have the purpose or effect of denying or impairing equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental political, economic, social and cultural freedoms. This understanding of racism on purpose or in effect is well grounded in the individual experiences of members of minority group, but these experiences reflect also the extent to which its reproduction by society's institutions reflect the extent to which racism is structurally embedded and in effect systemic. All of you who have spoken already have mentioned this, but I have to say it follows that initiatives to address it requires change at every level. Procedures on how work is done, policies and how they were conceived and shaped, and in the culture and thinking which inform both. Policy responsibles ultimately concerned with assimilation, accommodation or toleration, which I absolutely abhor, or cultural pluralism, which leaves differential power relations intact, cannot bring such change. It requires integration, but beyond that also acknowledging that groups experiencing racism are not only newly arrived, although all newly arrived groups do experience racism, but present for generations, to inclusion in the development of an intercultural society where diversity is celebrated. Education is often quoted as the key priority in this regard. I would not in any way downgrade education, but I think in any discussion on education, the barriers to education participation, the racism that impedes participation, not just participation, but access, participation and outcomes from education for marginalised and minority groups at each and every level need to be acknowledged. And for this to happen, it is a requirement in my understanding and in the way that we have tried to progress it in the work I've undertaken, that anti-racism education needs to be mandatory, it needs to be examined, and it needs to be part of promotional procedures in all of the roles that everybody, including all of you who work here in the UN and all of you who work as diplomats, undertake. Racism, then, is a toxic global discourse which, whatever the nature of each state today uses, it uses AI and social media to divide and instrumentalise the marginalised, whether from groups experiencing racism or groups which have been impoverished and pushed aside in the interests of power and profit by a few, or corrupt maintenance of power by the elite, as well put by Tendai Achiume, then Special Rapporteur on Racism, in a 2018 report. Hierarchies of oppression serve to reinforce this, but the continuing legacies of slavery and colonialism for people of African descent and indigenous peoples continue, as does centuries-old discrimination against Roma and travellers and other associated sometime nomadic groups. The normalisation of racism and of particular forms of racism and their implications for targeted groups have a resonance with the current horrors of Gaza. They were part of the drive to obliterate, which was the Holocaust of World War II, and are well understood by Roma and indigenous peoples throughout history, as well as by others globally, including Armenians and Australian Aboriginal groups. Today's focus on the incompatibility between democracy and racism is reflected in every and all understandings of democracy and its underpinnings, including the Human Rights Resolution of March 2015 and the Human Rights Council focus on what's possible as well as what needs to be stopped is, I believe, a good starting point, and one which we tried to reflect in Ireland's first National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism, saying inter alia what we were against, but also what we were for. Democracy, as the rule of law of the majority, cannot be used to undermine and violate the rights of minorities, or of minorities within minorities, including religious minorities, which can become the easy target of acceptable racism. And democracy requires the ongoing mirror of the critique civil society can provide, the creative tension which helps make it an instrument of rights, rather than the ongoing attempts which are now evident from Beijing to London and Washington, and points in between which seek to insist otherwise. The right to participate in public and political affairs is a founding hallmark of democracy and needs checks and balances which go well beyond national and local elections, which are, of course, very important. Participation by minorities as part of the judiciary and as lawyers and attorneys is also important, as is participation in policy and programme making and shaping. The participation of the Yogic People's Development Programme in Kenyan budget processes had positive outcomes and served awareness raising about the implications of these processes well beyond that particular budget. In Ireland, Traveller and Roma organisations over decades have engaged nationally with government and local authorities to address racism and realise rights. Traveller organisations sought and cross-government strategy for progress and targeted health and education strategies, and participated in their development and are now part of monitoring implementation of them. All of this was useful and informed the development of policies and actions for change, but the challenge of implementation remains, and the challenge to put in place the targets, timelines and resources required at every level to make change real in the lived experience of those the policies are for, as well as the collective progress towards full parity in Irish society, which is their right. Direct engagement in UN treaty bodies has also played an important role for travellers, leading over a period to recognition of traveller ethnicity, which the Taoiseach of the day did in our Dáil on March the 1st, 2017. Irish traveller organisations have also played leading roles in broader civil society struggles. This included work across EU member states during the 1990s, which contributed to the development of the EU directives on racism, a cause which was propelled in no small way by civil society throughout the European Union. And in Liberia, in West Africa, it was the efforts of women, including minority women, who camped outside Charles Taylor's residence that quickened in no small way the end of the then civil war. Recent EU developments include the EU Migration Pact. Civil society involvement is more tightly boundaried. The Pact's transposition and implementation is of considerable concern for democracy and migrants who could be increasingly criminalised and excluded, including through bilateral agreements now beginning to be made. I'm concerned that the associated racialisation of migration categories in this and other areas globally divides and discriminates systemically and contributes to ongoing development of control by the powerful who might be described as past and present colonisers. And I'm told I've said enough, which is probably more than the case. I'll hurry up and I'll finish as quickly as I can. There's a very concerning context, I think, at the moment with the rise of mis- and disinformations and sometimes small but loud far-right movements also using the internet to extend their influence on political discourse when not in power. MRG's Strategy 25-28 speaks to concern about the widening and deepening populist authoritarian trends and shrinking of civil society space. Hate crime and hate speech are on the rise globally and require robust legislation as well as the full attention to the provisions of General Recommendation 35 of CERD. There are examples of policy and practice which I'm sure we'll hear about in many states, and language also of commitment to continue on that road. Racism in all its forms has to be named and understood, also as part of the complex and contradictory construction of societies globally. The concern for disaggregated data expressed by all treaty bodies, not only to name and blame, but on the simple basis that addressing an issue demands knowing something of its extent, needs to be fully implemented by states parties to all of the conventions. Participation by racialised communities in public affairs is essential for democracy and brings benefit to all. Ways to include all, whatever their background, religion or status in the state, need and can be found, as the Council of Europe's principles on participation in local elections demonstrate. Participation doesn't guarantee implementation, but change in official culture is required. The realities of racism for and within minorities and for minority and women and girls mean that addressing racism in promoting democracy has to have an intersectional basis. I conclude by saying the language of duty bearers is easy to articulate, but the journey from needs to rights needs more consideration, courage and commitment, including with regard to whose rights come first in a world where racism has old and new faces. The language of the SDG calls us to move the furthest back forward first, and I look forward to hearing how we might do some of this.